welcome to our Carte Blanche discussion of cities compared, horizons and dilemmas. My name is Paavo Monkkonen and I'm a professor of urban planning and public policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs normally, but this year I'm here at the Paris IAS as a fellow. And I'm here with my office mate Gruia to talk to you today about some of our research and what we've learned from one another about urban comparison. I'll be talking about my work, which is on urban policy comparison, looking to this year at French social housing policy and the way cities in France are able to do urban interventions without the political pushback that we have in California.
And hi everyone, my name is Gruia Bădescu. I'm a research fellow at the Zukunftskolleg, the University of Konstanz in Germany. And I'm going to also talk about dilemmas and horizons of comparing cities, but from a historical and the longue durée perspective of cities that aspire to follow a particular urban model, like the Paris of the regions, but also my long-standing work on reconstruction of cities and how do we actually learn from best practices, so to say.
So we thought we'd record this carte blanche conversation together because we've actually really shared interests in urban comparison, and so we've entitled it Cities Compared, Horizons and Dilemmas, and our plan is for me to discuss a little bit my research and some of the issues with comparative urban policy studies, and then for Gruia to talk about his research. And then we'll have a brief Q&A with each other, learning from each other, approaching this topic from very different methodological backgrounds, but I think I've learned a lot from you.
And vice versa.
So I thought I'd share in this carte blanche a little bit about my research that does compare cities, but it's interesting, over my career I've changed more to urban policy comparison and comparing urban institutions as I've found a more focused goal, motivation for my work, which is to actually change policy and improve people's lives, hopefully somehow through research. And so I'm presenting my thoughts and a little bit of description of projects just in case that anyone who watches this can give me useful advice on how to proceed or some of the dilemmas that I face, and hopefully you'll learn something. So in my earlier work, I focused a lot on residential segregation, and I did a couple projects comparing first how urban segregation functions in different cities in the same country. So national studies in Mexico and China of as many cities as I could get data on where people lived and how the size of the city or its growth rate or inequality shaped patterns of residential segregation in those cities. And that was very interesting for me, but I think maybe a little less useful for the world research. It gives you insight into these structural factors of urban living that matter for people's lives, but it doesn't really tell you much how to change them. And so my work started focusing on policy, comparative urban policy, and I think this is kind of the big dilemma in my work, is connecting the urban space component to the policy component. So for example, I did what I thought was a super interesting study and I think useful for people that work in this space, comparing how property transactions are governed and regulated in Los Angeles and Tijuana, Mexico. So these totally different systems, a civil law country like Mexico, a common law country like the US, and it was responding to a debate in Mexico, an issue around the use of notaries, notarios, to govern this property transaction, and this idea that they were these corrupt kind of mafia of corruption around property transfers because you have to use them and they charge a lot of money. And so in comparing how the different steps of a property sale and the different institutions involved in Mexico with Los Angeles, I learned that in fact you could think that it was much cheaper to sell a property in the US or in California than it was in Mexico relatively because of the notaries. But in fact, once you got into the processes of sale, I learned that there were a lot more institutions in the US that were regulating this property transfer than in Mexico. And so in fact, the notary seemed expensive, but in fact was relatively less expensive than all the county recorder's office and the escrow and all these other things in the US. So that was a super interesting project, but it was not rooted in space in the way that my other work had been. And so, this year I'm in Paris, and last year I was in Lyon, looking at a couple different aspects of French urban and housing policy with the explicit goal of trying to bring those to California, because I think they provide people with a higher quality of life. And so studying social housing in France and studying the public process and political attitudes around housing densification and urban street space reallocation is what I've been doing. And this is something that is absolutely rooted in space, although you could study it in a way that isn't as rooted, right? So just looking at the financial structure of social housing landlords in France, you kind of lose sight of the history behind them and their location in, because of historical factors, more in the north, industrial cities of France than in the south, for example. So the juxtaposition with California, kind of the insights that I'm getting from doing this research here in comparison to kind of how I understand something like a public housing policy coming from the US, one of the dilemmas that I face, and so I guess an insight and then a dilemma. The insight is just really kind of naive perhaps, but just the role of history is so important, right? So these social housing providers, they have these Paris Habitat or the SNCF Habitat, EC Habitat. They have hundreds of thousands of units of social housing that they're able to continue renting because they've been building them for 100 years. And so in California, we're thinking about adopting a new model of social housing, but we should be looking maybe at early 20th century France rather than current France, because the current model is built on this 100 years of history. The dilemma, though, is how to translate that insight into some kind of actionable policy or some kind of advocacy language that I can use to actually make a difference in California. So sometimes I feel kind of odd because I'm having these insights about kind of, this is why it functions differently in this urban area than it would in another place. But then bridging the kind of understanding into action is really the dilemma. And in another project where I'm working with Magda Maui and my PhD student Aurora Echavarria, comparing how France, Mexico, and the US structure housing policies under this rubric of kind of fair housing or the right to housing. One of the insights from that is that, it's much perhaps more effective for a country like the US that has, lagging so much behind France in terms of good housing policy and good urban policy. So the comparison is, this beneficial to California because we can point to France as kind of an aspiration or a goal and get ideas for France or how we might do things differently. And then, but what does it mean for France, right? What does it mean for French advocates around the housing or urban policymakers to have other countries come and say, oh, you guys are doing so great, we want to copy your model. In fact, it might be a negative for them because then, conservatives that don't want to, invest more in housing or urban interventions might say, oh no, but we're already doing enough. We don't, everyone's coming here to study. We're great. We don't need to make progress. So I think this issue around kind of mobilizing the knowledge that comes out of urban comparison or policy comparison, I'm not sure what the answer is there. Kind of the differential benefits of it is something to think about.
I'm also interested in urban comparisons, but in a rather different way. I'm interested actually in comparing cities and also creating dialogues between them, especially cities across different regions. And it all started actually with my interest in post-war reconstruction. So how do cities get rebuilt after war? And while I was looking at a number of different situations, one particular dialogue interested in me, and that's Beirut and Sarajevo. One, a city in the Middle East that went through a number of wars and destructions and reconstructions. The other one in the Balkans, which suffered during the 1990s war in former Yugoslavia. But these cities have many things in common, and I was very intrigued on how they look so similar on paper, but actually they were so different in the way they felt and the way they actually behaved during Reconstruction. These cities were both part of the Ottoman Empire, then part of a empire like the Habsburgs or the French in the case of Lebanon, which created some form of modernity. Then they also share the fact that they have Christians, Muslims, Jews living side by side and speaking the same language, an mutually intelligible language. And they went through war and then Reconstruction. However, the outcomes were very different. So I was very intrigued by this dialogue, but also by the why of how the outcomes were different. And this, when we fall into this whole discussion of why are comparisons useful? So Charles Tilly wrote a whole typology of comparisons back in the day, talking about individualizing comparisons when you are trying to show that a place is different, but also about generalizing comparisons where you try to generate theory. But in this case, Sarajevo and Beirut showed variation-finding comparisons, when you're trying to find out why things go differently in a particular place rather than the other. In the broader work of post-war reconstruction, I tried to ask questions: to what extent can we use experience from elsewhere? And if you want to hear more, there's a piece I wrote for the eFlux architecture platform called Comparison and its Contents, so I can give the link right now. But going back to how do we understand these two cities in dialogue, everything changed when I started a collaboration with a filmmaker based in Lebanon, Sabine El-Shama. With her, we explored in a visual and an audio way how these cities feel, how does urban memory and urban space go hand in hand. And then you can see how different places can be, even if, again, they have so many things in common on paper. So through this sensorial and sensorial ethnography approach, we can also see comparisons in a different way. But now let me get to the project that I'm here for. And this is a project that I've been developing throughout the years on cities that wanted to be the Paris of their region, or they were called the Paris of their region. And there are many cities in the world that were compared to Paris, either by their own people or by outsiders. And I'm going back to Beirut in this case, the Paris of the Middle East, but in this case, looking at it in dialogue with Bucharest, my home city, the Paris of Eastern Europe, or Little Paris, and Buenos Aires, the Paris of South America. And here the question is, how do cities get compared to others? But also, how can we look at the trajectory of cities that might have this imaginary in common, but they have very different political, economic, sociocultural constellations and different ruptures, wars and dictatorships and political change. So how can we compare cities across time and across change? So these are actually questions about how do we look at the longue durée of places, and how can we look at time and place in a different way. So it's a rather different approach from looking at the normative of the policy. But I think it's very important to actually look at how do we make sense also of historically and ethnographically based comparisons in relationship to what Paavo is doing, which is very, very important and useful for the world today. How do we understand how policies can circulate? So let's actually discuss a bit about this. So Paavo, what do you think makes a comparison between urban policies different? To what extent, when we talk about normative rather than just analytical comparisons, you have different challenges?
Yeah, I think with the policy comparison, one of the big issues is contextual differences. So one of the challenges that I've seen in discussing in California, the idea of a social housing program like France's, is people say, oh no, it's just so different. Like there's no way we could do this one idea that they have because everything about this place is different. And I think actually one of the benefits of doing the more grounded comparative work is that I found a lot more similarities than I expected between kind of some of the core issues around urban space. So, you know, the rich wanting to be in their own enclaves and the inequality of, you know, access to different amenities in a city. And, you know, the challenge of kind of connecting people to all of the benefits of a city. So I think that showing the similarities, then you can say, look, it's not that different and they have this superior policy. Why don't we, you know, maybe it's a possibility. I don't know if...
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I was working on postal reconstruction and I was asked also for policy recommendations, it's interesting, there was a very important dilemma. And something I came up with then, and I'm curious what you think of this, is that when you do what I was mentioning earlier, universalizing comparisons, when you try to see what pattern or what process do we get from comparisons, I was saying it's more the negative, the things that didn't go well in a place that we have to be careful in another place. So I was less looking at best practices, because best practices can and have to be contextualized. Exactly what you were saying.
Warnings.
More warnings. So to what extent do you think that's
yeah, no, I haven't. I mean, since I'm a bit more on the kind of aspirational model adoption kind of side of things, so I haven't really thought about that. But it's a really important point. I mean, it's funny because, you know, your project on the Parises of their region made me realize like I'm actually trying to make LA, the Paris of California or something, Paris of the US. And so I wonder, I mean, on that topic, like, you know, I'm looking at the benefits of having an urban model to aspire to. I don't know if it's something you've thought about kind of as beneficial or dangerous. I mean, I feel like a lot of the time in the policy mobilities literature, it's quite critical of this importing of policies or exporting of policies.
What's interesting that we have models that are generic, like the smart city, the resilient city, but then we have a city that inspires through its actions. So in this case, it's interesting when you talk about a new Paris, remaking.
Not Haussmannian,
but it's very different. It's a very different reference. So,
so
what you're looking at is a completely different Paris because it's a Paris that talks about housing in a different way, justification.
Yeah.
So it's rather different approaches than what these cities in the 19th century, early 20th century were looking at.
Right.
So that's interesting to historicize the future, to historicize with the aspiration for the future, because it's so different to think about the modernity that these cities wanted, like Buenos Aires or Bucharest, etc. back then, and now it's actually about a set of practices that somehow relate to the model of the smart, resilient, etc. city, but it's actually way more.
I think having a physical space to show people is really important, right? So you can talk about the abstract idea of a sustainable city, but it's much more easy to grab onto it if you say like, oh, like this, here's a picture of a beautiful place. And I think with Paris, it's interesting because I'm not advocating by any means for Haussmannian style destruction in California, but it's helpful that the buildings are beautiful, right? Because there are probably other cities, I mean, there are other cities that are doing just as much on pedestrianization or densification. In fact, Paris proper, it's not doing great on densification because of all the beautiful buildings. But it's maybe more helpful to have the beautiful model. I wonder whether in your work you've seen this in the reconstruction efforts. I mean, the reconstruction stuff is so interesting because it's a post-crisis and destruction. It's like a moment to do things differently. I don't know if you've seen kind of how people talk about the next. The imaginary is in a moment of flux, and what are they?
But actually, this is the kind of there's a tendency in many war situations to have people who really want to have the newest, the best ideas floating at the moment. In the Second World War, for instance, they all wanted. I mean, many planners in Britain, in Germany, etc., wanted to take advantage of the destruction to actually promote a car-friendly, wide avenues city, and they designed plans that later actually were realized. I think now, if you look at discussions in Ukraine, in Gaza, etc., or on them from outside, you also see that there's a tendency of wanting a tabula rasa approach. Well, I think now, after all these decades, we learned from many places how important it is actually to have these dialogues with people, with residents, to actually understand what they want and to kind of mediate. Urban planning now is a more mediation, it's more negotiation, more or less. So that basically the future is not only decided by these technical planners as before, but it's actually, at least we hope, it's actually a more democratic process of determining what the future is and what the spatial imaginary of the future is.
Yeah, on that, I mean, the spatial imaginary stuff is very fascinating to me, but sometimes challenging because I want to see a lot of data and survey evidence or something. I'm not sure, how you think about. I mean, how are you comfortable researching it without having, to really know what everybody's is? You know what I mean? Like for me, it would be like an ongoing frustration to like not be able to know. But you're very good at, like you understand how some people think about it and others, and that's all you can have,
also,
right?
It's a very long duration. So this, I think, to look at cities from this perspective, we need to use not only historical but particularly ethnographic research. So we need a lot of team effort in understanding what are different. We can say groups of people, but what are different memory cultures, different aspirations. And this is a very long duration process. We cannot do it. It's actually one of the issues that in this kind of field, when you talk about policy transfer, sometimes if the analysis is very short term, it risks to miss all these valuations of people. So that's why, for instance, you've been spending already a few years in doing this. It's very different than people who come and have a weekend to understand the policy in France, and then they will go back and report. I think time. We need time, and we need slowness to actually really understand what's happening in a place. Research, even if we need a policy outcome, I think we need to really have a dialogue with people who spend enough time to understand the place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you find that frequently in the urban policy world, people just read about the place?
And taking an off-the-shelf kind of like, what should we do? I mean, one of the things though is that policies change so infrequently in most places that, you know, you can have so much and lengthy discussion about what to do when in fact it's hard to make a big difference. And especially changing like to a totally different model. I mean, with the case of, you know, public housing policy in the US, the way we're doing it now has been around since the 80s, and changing that is going to be very difficult, even though we can get a lot of agreement around, you know, trying to do a European style approach. I think actually changing is hard. And I think the US is actually, I mean, right now we're undergoing a moment of dramatic change at the national level, but I think that it's actually a place that has changed urban policies relatively little compared to European countries. I mean, in France, you know, they create metropolitan governments. They do this. I mean, they're really merging, you know, small communes around fiscal issues, and in a way that, you know, we just don't do that. I don't know, you know, the inertia of physical urban space, and then there's like the inertia of the imaginary, and then like, you know, how policy change fits into that. I don't know. It's something I've been thinking about, like trying to understand, trying to compare how different countries take that on.
In any case, comparisons are an ongoing discussion. I mean, from academic research, you have comparative urbanism, trying to show that there's no just one way of understanding a city. It's a kind of a post-colonial understanding, like Jennifer Robinson, who are looking seeing the city from another perspective, to looking at outcomes in reconstruction, in policy transfers, etc. But the jury's still out there. How do we do comparisons, whether they make sense? Some people are very against comparative research, while others see the benefits. So we're also very curious what you think. And while you have here some links of some articles that we have on comparisons, we'd love to hear from you. And what do you think works best in comparisons? And
yeah, thanks so much. This is fascinating, and I've learned a lot from your comparative work, and I hope to be able to bring those insights into my future work.
And I've learned also so much from you, and also the importance of thinking about real action through changing policy, and actually of taking and getting inspired. So what you actually what you've been doing this year is actually somehow taking these insights, the way that these people that shaped the Parises of the regions I researched in the past, now you're also taking the knowledge, and hopefully it'll have an impact in changing policy in California and beyond. So we see the dialogue between the applications and the questions we're having. So thank you very much.
Thanks.